Hello, 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 and welcome to our episode of Manifesting Inclusion. We are so excited to have you all here. We will get around to introductions in a second. But if you love what we're saying, please come in and give us a shout out. So, my name is Lee Miles. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm one half of the Manifesting Inclusion co founding team. And I'm so excited that you all have joined us today. Let's get to a couple more introductions, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Laura Gonzalez.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Laura Gonzalez. I use she, her pronouns. And as Lee mentioned, we are collaborating together on Manifesting Inclusion, which is a big umbrella project, which includes a book to be coming. It includes this speaker series. It includes a number of public presentations. But our main goal is just to gather, to draw together as community and to think along with brilliant colleagues about what it can mean to make inclusion and equity more real in our daily spaces. And so we're really excited to have with us today Jennifer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. G. We're going to pass it over to Jennifer. And just so you all know, today we're going to have an amazing conversation about how to support and create spaces for neuroinclusive and neurodivergent folks like myself. And so we're welcome with our wonderful panelist today, Jennifer. So, Jennifer, if you give us a brief introduction, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks so much, Lee and Laura. I'm excited to be here. My name is Jennifer. My pronouns are she and they. For a visual description, I am a queer, fat, femme, white person with teal glasses. I have a bit of a swoosh of hair. Kind of to the side of my forehead, and I have shaved sides. I am wearing a black shirt with gold stars on it, and I am sitting in front of a galaxy tapestry that's of blues and greens and purple. You might notice like a celestial theme here. That's on brand for me. um, I am the founder and CEO of Expansive Expressions, which is a neuroinclusion, accessibility, leadership development consultancy working with companies to build better businesses neuroinclusively.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So, our first question, actually, let's get into a little bit of house rules. I forgot for today. Our conversation today is going to be one that where we often talk about people and statistics being interchangeably. Myself being neurodivergent, I'm constantly thinking about how do I affirm my identities and how I show up. And so we ask for you all to participate in the chat. So down below, you will see some emojis. You'll see some thumbs, you'll see some hand claps, you'll see some hearts. Give us a little bit of love if you're on the show. I see we've got about 6 or 7 people watching right now. A couple other house rules is if you want to make some comments, we would love that if you engage with us. We simply ask that if you ask a question, put a Q and a colon beside in the chat. That way we know that it's a question to answer and not just a comment as house rules. And last but not least, if you're here with us today and you're enjoying this format, or if you would just like to share that you're a part of it, go ahead and click the arrow that's pointed to the right. If you're able to locate that, and you can share this conversation with your colleagues, not only share with them the wealth of knowledge we're going to be talking about today, but also the fact that you are here and engaging in this professional development. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we're going to hop into our first question. So we have you here, Jennifer, and we're so excited to learn from you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you've done recently with your company and how you got into this work? Who are you and why is it important to you, friend?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I am a retired licensed marriage and family therapist. I worked in that field, seeing clients directly as a licensed clinician for about 15 years, specializing in complex systems trauma. So I worked with folks who were escaping and recovering and deconstructing from high control religion, worked with folks who are survivors of the troubled teen industry, the unjust system, um, folks who were previously incarcerated, uh, all kinds of like really any any system that has resulted in trauma. That is work that I did with folks, and doing that work, and I was most recently, I'm based in Texas, and doing that work, kind of seeing the intersections of systemic impact on folks, kind of got to the point where I felt like individual therapy work, especially under a Western medical pathologizing model, it was not, it kind of reached its limits in the work that it could do in terms of affecting systemic change. And that's not to say that I don't value therapy. There is a place for it. For me and my system's thinky brain, I just came to the place where I wanted to be involved in more of how do you affect systemic change at the top, so that the impact on folks who are within those systems, like workplaces and schools and, whatever places that we're in life, the impact could be a more inclusive, equitable, psychologically safe experience for folks. And so in 2022, I closed my practice, my therapy practice, and began Expansive Expressions, the consultancy. Also, what also happened that was another significant catalyst for this change is that in 2021, I came into full awareness of my own autistic ADHD like learning differences, and throw in a whole toss salad of neurodivergence identity in there. And coming into awareness of that at age 42 has been a trip, for one, but it also made me examine the work that I was doing and thinking about how my business is set up and the kind of capacity spend that is required of me is not ultimately sustainable. And so that also contributed to my decision to kind of reevaluate the kind of work that I was doing, what would be accessible for me, as I was continuing to learn about myself and my needs, and how I could put my brain to work for our community at large.
Do you want me to take a question, Lee?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I wonder, given your vast knowledge, both in terms of personal knowledge and awareness of what is neuroinclusion or neuronormativity, and also sort of your conceptual knowledge, in order for us all to be on the same page and understanding these terms, which are kind of big and can be intimidating, can you just help our audience think about what those words mean in a practical way or in a helpful way?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the way I see neuronormativity is kind of the mainstream default culture that, at least here in the US, is seen as regular and normal. So, and again, in like the way my brain works, connecting dots and thinking systemically, I associate neuronormativity with, I know this is controversial, but with white supremacy. It's a construct of white supremacy, because white supremacy is all about there is one way, one standard, one person, one look that is, the best, that is supreme, and everything else is less than, right? So neuronormativity is the practice of like having normalized one neurotype, one way of brains working, and diminishing all the rest. And in that way, there's a lot of conversations around the terms that we use, and I don't think there's any one monolith, especially in a neurodivergent community. I particularly love the word neurodivergent, because I think about like, well, if neuronormativity is this rigid narrow, discriminatory standard, then yes, I absolutely do want to diverge from that path to embrace, a more inclusive and equitable way of being in the world that honors the vast myriad of variations and possibilities and perspectives that our beautifully diverse brains embody. So neuronormativity is kind of the standard that has been set by society for this is how you should act and this is how you should think. And for those of us who are, well, not just for those of us who are late identified, everyone who's neurodivergent, if they're a product of kind of mainstream public schools, we are pressured to perform neuronormativity. And a word that often goes with that is masking. Not health masking, but like the masking of performing neuronormativity in order to downplay our more open neurodivergent characteristics and traits like stimming and fidgeting and not making eye contact and the way that we talk. Maybe you might notice this in how I talk, just kind of rambling around in my mind. All of the things that I'm mentioning are connected. And sometimes when I'm talking about things, a listener isn't always aware of does not see the connections the way that I do in my mind. So neuroinclusion is kind of an alternative to neuronormativity that invites us to kind of hold wonder and curiosity without a hard and fast knowing. And that sounds really abstract and nebulous. What does that mean? So neuroinclusion means that, okay, we have this problem to solve. There could be infinite ways to solve this problem. Let's hear all of these ideas and think about what's going to be the most efficient or what's going to be the most compatible with the resources that we have. What is going to serve the people who are working on this project, right? All of those things are rooted in curiosity and allowing space for there to be more than one way of approaching a certain thing. Additionally, to me, neuroinclusion is also must be rooted in decentering whiteness and white supremacy, decolonizing and deconstructing those elements, those systems of oppression. Um, Again, because neuroinclusion is about kind of casting off this pressure to perform one way of being in the world and embracing the absolutely diverse ways of being, whether that is physical apparent disabilities, non-apparent disabilities, whether that's queerness or gender expansiveness or just any kind of way of being in the world. It's affirming of that and affirming that brains think differently, they learn differently, they communicate differently, and differently is not wrong or bad. That was a lot, but I'll pause there.
No worries. I have a follow-up question about that. And I love when you talked about the little things like masking, right? So I found myself in graduate school thinking a lot about how do I show up authentically, but then how do I also get the resources that I needed to feel normal in a classroom space, right? So, what are some of those things that you see that typically play out in those learning environments? We have a lot of folks that we work with professionally and do presentations for that might be thinking about, well, am I neurodivergent? Like, do I need to go take a test? How do I go about finding out if I'm on the spectrum? So, what does all that mean, and what are some typical signs that kind of show up and play out?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I think like there are jokes that a lot of us in the late identified community shared that like if you go on a deep dive research, wondering if you're autistic or ADHD or both, chances are you are. Like, that's a self-validating behavior kind of thing. Like neurotypical people who are not curious about that are not taking all of the am I autistic quizzes online that they could possibly find, right? So there's there's a little bit of levity to the, like, let's look at some of the behaviors you're doing. I'm late identified as a queer person as well, and I feel like my journey into my queer identity and my journey into my neurodivergent identity are very similar. Like, I was reading all the content that I could find and doing this very, like, Socratic method of exploring myself and my identity to come to a conclusion of, like, yes, okay, for sure. There's this other piece that I've encountered and I experienced myself, that there are a ton of people who relate to, you know, memes and videos that neurodivergent lived experience folks share, but there's a hesitancy to kind of claim that identity, kind of like an imposter syndrome feeling around that. Like, I don't want to take up space in an identity group that I'm not actually a part of. Um, and so I just want to encourage folks who are kind of exploring and thinking about their own potential neurodivergence, that if you are finding terminology that fits you, fits things that you have experienced, and you know, you are finding, like, oh my gosh, these are my people. Like, I thought I was the only one in the whole world who did this or thought this way or, you know, had this quirk. If you're finding language that fits, if you're finding a sense of belonging, then you absolutely belong. Like, part of neuroinclusion is being very much opposed to gatekeeping. So in the neurodivergent community, self-identification is absolutely valid. Like, there's nobody collecting, like, well, where are your formal assessment documents? So there's an affirmation of, like, if this feels like it fits, then it's for you. And yes, you belong here. Um, I think because so many of us have experienced not belonging and feeling like an outsider. My whole life, I was like, I for sure am not from planet Earth. Like, I don't know where I'm from, but I can't be from this planet because I don't understand what these human people are doing. That it doesn't make sense. And so creating spaces where belonging can be experienced by people and affirming, yes, you belong here, is such a huge core piece of neuroinclusion. And I don't know if I exactly answered your question, so you can ask it again, Lee, if I need to course correct.
Yeah, I would love to know a little bit more about how you figured out. So for
Mm,
me,
okay.
it was through education where my professor was like, you're a little bit different there. But what was that process like for you? And how might someone else, now that they've gone down the rabbit hole, begin to get some professional resources to aid their educational and professional journey?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so I found myself relating to a lot of the autistic and ADHD memes that were going around social media. It I am someone who watched a lot of TikTok videos and Instagram reels from folks with lived experience and found myself like, "Oh my gosh, that's me. How are they, like, telling me what's going on in my brain to myself?" And those resources led to other resources, like Embrace Autism is a website that is run by and for neurodivergent people. There are neuro-affirming, kind of self-assessments that you can take for free on that website, so that's an excellent resource. There are more and more neuro-affirming, therapists and assessors who are providing assessments, especially for late identified folks, that are specifically like the approaches are specifically designed to accommodate for how neurodiversity, things like autism and ADHD, show up in people who are non-cis het white men. That's part of the challenge. Is the diagnostic criteria has historically been based on how these things present in cis het white boys. And so everybody who's not that, who presents differently, who's socialized to present differently, gets missed and overlooked. And so there has been in the last few years a huge effort to develop resources for, you know, what does autism look like in Black girls and Black women? What does ADHD look like in non-binary, gender expansive folks, right? People who are not fitting that diagnostic criteria, but still having these experiences of, you know, I relate to these things. And that was true for me as a clinician who studied these things, who studied, you know, the DSM. You know, there's some parts sometimes where I'm like, wow, that's really embarrassing that I didn't know this about myself. But part of why I didn't know this about myself is that my socialization growing up, I was socialized as a girl, and I grew up in a high control religion, and so those socializations trained me to like be very internalized, to be very quiet, pleasant, obedient, right? And those are like that socialization process was teaching me how to mask anything that was autistic or ADHD characteristics and features. So there is an organization called Autism in Black that helps Black families to understand, what does this look like? How does this show up in our communities, and what are the resources that are going to be relevant to us? There is, let's see, I believe their name is AJ Singh, and they have a program called Autistic Wayfinders, which is deconstructing and decentering whiteness for late identified autistics. So there are resources kind of in addressing the intersectionality of neurodivergent identity for folks to explore, not just, you know, kind of in clinical terms, but also more and more in through like lived experience terms, and validating what people are living and experiencing, even if it's different from what things look like clinically. Sorry, another resource is NeuroSpark Health is a neurodivergent run private practice that provides assessments for or for adults who suspect that they're late identified. And so it's a very neuro affirming process, which means that you know, there are many stories of women and femme folks trying to get diagnosis and them being dismissed because, like, well, you made eye contact through the whole interview, or I mean, you seem to have empathy, so there's no way you could possibly be autistic, right? So those stereotypes applied has kept some people from being affirmed in kind of what they know for themselves. So finding a neuro affirming provider, whether it's NeuroSpark or there are several directories of ND practitioners and neuro inclusive practitioners. Those are ways to find providers who operate from the neuro inclusion perspective versus a more like clinical medical model.
I really appreciate everything that you've been saying about affirming community and finding your people and understanding yourself and being able to name your own experience and relate to similar experiences, especially knowing, you know, that very narrow diagnostic and stigmatizing way of thinking that comes like not only from, psychology and psychiatry, but also I think about our education system and how it also, asks people
Mhm.
to function in this very like rigid, narrow way. As you were saying, many workspaces are similarly rigidly
Yeah.
and narrowly defined. And so I love your emphasis on, you don't need to look to that narrow hallway and think, oh, I don't fit. What you need to do is turn in another direction and find the spaces where you are included, you are
Mhm.
respected and valued. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about sort of the role of inclusion and ability to thrive in different kinds of spaces. I know we all inhabit different spaces in our lives, but so what does inclusion and thriving look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think um, I'm going to start answering that by answering something else. this is this is my way. Um, so one of the things that I think, like you just mentioned, Dr. G, about like kind of opening up to the expansiveness of what is neurodiversity, neuroinclusion. It's part of why expansive is in the title of my business. I think, like, for me, that's a concept that is really thrilling and exciting. I think for others, the idea that it is so varied and expansive can feel overwhelming and intimidating. I think about leaders that I've talked to who are like, well, that's so many variables to consider all the neurodivergences, to consider all the disability and accessibility needs. How do we possibly anticipate that or implement when there are infinite combinations and variables? And what I like to emphasize is that we don't have to know all of those variables. There are practices that we can engage in that can, one, at least like start the conversation and get a culture started of inclusion. My huge like broken record refrain is, can we please lead with curiosity? That will get us so far in the efforts of weaving inclusion into our spaces, into our processes, into our systems, our policies, and our culture. That we don't have to know everything ahead of time, but if we can be curious about a student's performance, like, hey, I know that you're really bright. Tell me about what's going on. Your scores have been different lately. Participating in class has been different lately. Has something changed in life? What is going on in your world? What is going on in your mind? How might we be able to set this up in a way that would work for you? For instance, my godson is neurodivergent, and he was really struggling with his um, written test questions in one subject. And he goes to this amazing neuroinclusive school. And so one of his teachers was like, you know what? Come with me. Let's go for a walk. And on that walk, the teacher asked every single question that was on that test. And verbally, my godson was able to answer them all correctly. And so that teacher, like, had a moment, was curious, maybe this method of regurgitating information doesn't work with this kiddo's brain. And maybe there's another way that we can access the information that I know is in there, in a way that is going to work for his brain. And that's such a beautiful example of kind of how curiosity and flexibility can lend itself to people having an opportunity to succeed. I think most humans want the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the space that they're in, whether it's a classroom or in the workplace. And in order to be able to contribute meaningfully, there has to be elements of like inviting those contributions, psychological safety to offer a suggestion, and not have it like completely shut down right off the bat. But having an environment that is kind of rooted in curiosity and wonder. When I'm talking with leaders, I encourage them, as they're navigating problem solving, ask the question, whose perspective am I missing here? Whose input have I not yet gotten on like how to approach this problem? Is there somebody in the room who hasn't spoken up, and is there a way to invite them to speak up, whether that's privately one-on-one, like, hey, I know you don't love talking in front of groups in the meetings, but I wanted to get your input on what your thoughts are on how we can approach this project. If you have ideas and suggestions, I'd love to schedule a time to listen to them, right? Like that is a practice of inclusion, not just being like, well, they didn't speak up, so I guess they don't have any ideas, right? So I'll pause there.
Those are such great examples, and there's a theme that runs throughout our book that is kind of learning, unlearning, and relearning, which I think is very aligned with your mantra of curiosity and wonder. So not just assuming that we know everything all the time, which is not really possible anyhow, but thinking about, what do I need to step back and unlearn myself in my own practices if I'm approaching my day in a, normative, typical, average way. What do I need to reconsider? And I think, like, when I think back to the pandemic and how we had opportunities there to reconsider how we do work, how people engage, how we communicate, how we trust people to do tasks more independently and the way that works for them. I'm sad that it feels like we haven't stuck with some of those new things we learned. But those kinds of opportunities to just have a little bit of curiosity and rethink, well, could it work this way? Is there any reason we can't try it?
Yeah, and that it's something that I am in continual practice of myself. Like this, I sorry, there's like 5 sentences trying to come out at the same time. So part of my own process and journey has included and will include probably for the rest of my existence, the deconstructing of internalized ableism. And so I'm practicing leading with curiosity even for myself. When I come upon a situation at home, when I'm like shoulding all over myself, like, oh, I should do this, I should do that. And I catch myself, I'm like, okay, how can I be curious? Like maybe there's a different way that I could approach doing laundry that works for how my brain works or works for like my actual environment and life, that is not just like what catalogs teach or what TV shows teach, right? So even around my own home space, how can I be curious? One of the shifts that I made is um, and I learned this from the internets, of no longer using the vegetable drawer for vegetables, because that's just basically where they go to wilt and I forget they exist. But instead, my vegetable drawer contains all my chocolate, and I put my vegetables on the top shelf of my fridge, because then when I open the fridge, I see them. Oh yes, vegetables and produce, excellent, I want to eat some. If they're in the drawer, I'm not going to see them. So there are things like that that we can be curious about even in our own spaces, of like, what, just because this is how it's shown, or how my cubicle was presented to me, maybe there's a different arrangement, um, process, order of things that could better accommodate how our brains work, how our minds think about things. And when we begin to accommodate ourselves, we begin to reclaim capacity that has otherwise been drained by trying to perform, doing things the way that everybody else is doing them, because that's just how it's done or that's how it's taught, but it's not actually what's like most efficient or sustainable for us.
I love those thoughts about reclaiming that capacity. Um, I've thought a lot about in my personal life, you say the chocolate. Well, I have a specific day that I like clean the house because if I don't clean it and in this way, it's not going to get done, right? And I had a conversation with my partner. I think it was last week or the week before, and she's like, "So is this a thing for like your brain, or is this like you have a thing?" And I'm like, "Well, if I get it done first thing in the morning, Saturday morning in this particular way it gets done. I can now loosen this mental capacity to be able to do other things, right? So if it's making tea, preparing my cup in advance, because there have been many of times where I've made tea and I have forgotten the sugar, and that's what we don't do, right? I need my honey. And so those little tools are really helpful. What are some other practical tips? I love the thing about the chocolate. I don't think that's just for folks, but we know that things like sugar impact our brain and our health even more, right? But what are some other practical tips that you've picked up on from the interwebs, the Facebooks, the tickety tocketies, that you found to be super helpful in integration of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've learned about myself that if I can't see it, it doesn't exist. So whether it's vegetables or art supplies, I have learned that the most effective ways for organizing and storing things is either, some way that's out or in clear containers, for instance, rather than opaque containers behind closed doors. So I have I am one of those ADHDers who wants to learn all the different art things. So I have a lot of art supplies. So things like hanging my paint tubes on the wall so that I can see what colors I have uh, is more effective than having all my paint tubes in a box, right? Because then when I go to the store, I think, "Ooh, I need more of this color," and I come home and I already have 5 tubes of that color because I can't easily glance at it and see what I need or don't need. Um, I think one of the resources that has been such a huge help for me is Casey Davis on Instagram. She's Struggle Care. On TikTok, it's Domestic Blisters. She's an ADHD therapist who has really done so much to help me heal my relationship with like clutter and mess. One of her messages is mess is morally neutral. Let's detangle like moral character from chores and mess, right? Like those are pretty puritanical beliefs that we want to deconstruct from. And just her kind of publicly living out her process of like, you know what? Who says my house has to be set up like this? Like if it makes most sense for me to put a laundry basket in the living room when my kids which that's where my kids take off their socks and so they can just put them in the laundry basket in the living room, then I'm going to do that. That might not be the most like homes and gardens aesthetically pleasing, but it works for my family and it reduces, the stress and the tension of like pick up your socks, and it reduces, the capacity of having to go collect them from all over. Just put a laundry bin where it makes sense. So sometimes it's really this practice of like giving ourselves permission to make things easier for ourselves. If there's an example of something that we see someone else do, and I think another part of why I do the work that I do is kind of a paying forward. The people who have been courageous to speak up about to speak up and share their lived experience helped me to identify myself, and I want to contribute to that. I want there to be more resources that are accessible to, you know, my peers as well as the generations coming up, so they don't get to 42 without knowing this essential information about how their brain works, but they have the language, they have the um, kind of relatable experiences earlier on in life to be able to connect with, oh yeah, this is me, and this is it's normal to have different brain types and different ways of doing things and different ways of setting up the systems in our home, in our school, in our workplace.
That sounds great. Thanks so much. One of the things that I found super helpful too, in thinking about that is thinking about list. So not only putting it in my calendar, but also having like a physical list that I can check off. And
Mm.
the way to free up that brain capacity is taking a couple seconds and just writing it down. Because not only am
Mm.
I probably not going to finish the sentence, but I might not even finish the task. And so it's not often working through the task or having the motivation to start it. For me, it's that squirrel, or you go down the rabbit hole of wanting to write a note or paint a picture, and then all of a sudden you become a watercolorist, and then the watercolorist becomes an artisan, and then you learn about candle making, and all of a sudden you're a candle maker. And so it's organizing the fact that right now all we're supposed to do is write a note. That's it. And
Why are
so
you
I
telling on me to the whole internet, Lee?
Listen, I'm snitching on us, and nobody's getting stitches over here. So that's just a little note. We're going to switch to some question and answer. We know that we have a little delay with our online participants, but if you all have questions for us or comments, or you would like to share a story, we would love for you all to comment on what your experience have been. If you're on the spectrum like me, or you identify as an ADHD, or you've seen the TikToks and you're like, that sounds a lot like me, please drop a heart, leave us a comment. We would love to connect with you, not only for a form of this talk, but also a place where we can build community. I love the chocolate and the vegetable drawer example. And I just want to take a couple minutes while folks are dropping questions to think about some of the resources that we listed off. So we talked a lot about masking. And just as a recap today, we talked about that being a performative way to think about how we show up. So we're downplaying our inability to stay on task, right? And I don't know how no one caught it my whole life, but it was my professor that was like, "You started that paper and never finished it, but you talked about it in class," and that's the first time I was like, "Oh, I didn't." You talked about autism in Black and how does that show up for Black folks specifically, and I know that's a resource that I'll be touching into. And Jennifer, thank you so much. I know you're going to drop these links to the different resources that you shared in the chat. We've got Embrace Autism. So that's some self-assessment. So if folks are thinking about how might they be showing up, or maybe a loved one, specifically if you have kids, that's something big to think about. I saw a statistic the other day that said about 30% of the students that are going to be coming in the 2020s classes and 2030s classes are going to be identifying as neurodivergent, or at least needing resources of intersecting things. So if you're in orientation, do you have quiet room spaces that can be a very rah type of environment? If you're going to have a DJ party, do you have a silent listening party where folks don't have to interact with others? Those are just some things. We also talked about the Autistic Wayfinders, I believe, where we decentering that for folks, and thinking about getting away from this whiteness and whitewashing mental health spaces and support spaces. And we've got NeuroSpark Health. And I know that Jennifer has a ton of other resources, but we would love to take some time and introduce you all, or answer any of your questions in the chat. So we've got Sarah. Thanks for joining us, Sarah. That says, yes, so much trouble with that object permanence with the ND brain. I totally get that, darling. And thanks for coming in, Sarah. Emily Blackenberger says, I would like to know how you overcome anxiety of taking up space. So I would love to hear your answer from that, Jennifer.
Yeah, I love this question so much. Um, and I'm going to answer that by telling a little bit of a story. So, when I was first exploring my neurodivergence, I was talking to a friend and I was trying to tell her, yeah, so I'm pretty sure I'm neurodivergent. But what my brain and my mouth said was, I'm pretty sure I'm neurodefiant. And my friend was like, what is that? I was like, neurodivergent, like, different things. She was like, but no, you said neurodefiant. And I was like, oh, I kind of love that because it goes with I feel like my personality, and the more I get to know myself, the more I practice defiance against like the kind of constricting identities that were imposed on me. And so part of what has helped me to overcome things like anxiety of taking up space is like kind of challenging it defiantly of like the society wants me to play small and be quiet and has told me my whole life I'm too much and too loud and too passionate. Well, I'm done being quiet. I'm done being small. So I'm gonna be loud. I'm going to be my vibrant self. And it takes practice, right? Like I didn't go one day shrinking myself to the next day. Ta-da! I'm here, all of me. But it's practice. And one of the threads of this conversation has been community and having safe, inclusive community where we can practice taking up space and it be affirmed and celebrated plays such a huge role in our ability to move forward, right? So it's not just something that I could do by myself privately. I needed to experience taking up space in community with others and have that celebrated and affirmed to be able to like continue doing that and then take that courage that I built up in that safe community out into the world that is less safe or who knows, so many other unknown variables.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I hope that we can put a couple of these recaps out sometime this week too, because that's a brilliant question. We've got another question from Rachel, which says, what have been the most helpful and supportive things for you in the workplace? And that could be in a remote workplace or an in-person workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me personally, working remotely has been a huge accommodation. Before the pandemic, I was seeing clients in person in my office, and I transitioned to telehealth in March of 2020. And even as I don't know, into 2021 and beyond, folks were like, are you going to go back to the office? And when I thought about that question, I thought, no, I don't want to. I've learned to accommodate myself in so many ways in my home space. So one of those accommodations is using headphones because I have auditory processing issues. And so when the sound is like just piped right into my ears, it is easier for me to process that sound and what's being said versus having to strain through all kinds of environmental noise to find what is being said to me. Things like the kinds of clothes that I wear, right? There are ways to dress, business casual, in more comfortable clothes. So sometimes that might look like different kinds of like stretchy yoga pants for people, finding shoes that are more comfortable, right? To still maintain the dress code, but be wearing things that actually work for my body and aren't distracting because they're itchy or there's a seam or it's too tight in one part. So those are a handful of things. Oh, one other thing, I put in my on my work email, I put in my signature that my work hours may vary from the person who's receiving it. So, please honor your own boundaries. Like if I sent this at 2 a.m., because that's when my brain was working, don't feel the need to answer at 2:05 a.m. Like you answer in your own timeline. And I also put in there that generally it takes me, 3 to 5 days to turn around on responses so that I'm giving myself a little bit more space and kind of fighting against that. Like I'm available on demand to people.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering those questions. And we definitely appreciate having you all here and those questions. We hope if you go back to this event, we will have these questions as well as a replay available online. We are also streaming this over to YouTube, so we'll share where that is. A couple other notes that we'll have is take some time and process the questions that we have in this conversation, as well as engage with us on manifesting inclusion .com and also over on Manifesting Inclusion on our LinkedIn site. We're going to pass it over to Jennifer to tell us where to find you and where to continue the conversation. Where can we hire you? And uh, where can we connect with you as not only a human, but also a professional?
Yeah, thank you so much. So my business is Expansive Expressions, expansiveexpressions.com. And I have kind of two main arms of that business. I have the kind of corporate consulting, leadership development portion where I contract with companies and organizations to help them integrate more neuro-inclusive practices. And then the other arm is I have I call it the Neurodefiant Collective, which is a membership community for neurodivergent and disabled entrepreneurs, business owners, and professionals. So that's a space that includes group coaching, co-working sessions, social circle, networking. That is all highly intentionally neuro-inclusive. So it's a space where we can share ideas and support for how do we do this building a business that's neuro-inclusive and accessible to us while also being neuro-inclusive and accessible to the people that we work with. How do we navigate, ethical commerce and rejecting some of the like productivity pressure from capitalism to embrace, we want to build a thriving life for ourselves, but not burn ourselves out. So we talk about all those things. And then we have co-working sessions where we support each other in doing anything from, gross admin paperwork that none of us like to do, or, sometimes folks come in there like, you know what, I need a snack and a nap. And so that's what I'm going to do during co-working because that's what I need. That's what my body and my brain needs. So those two spaces, Expansive Expressions under that Neurodefiant Collective is for individuals who want to join community. And then the consulting services are for businesses who want to grow.
That is awesome. Well, I'm going to just draw our time together to a close today, but I just really want to appreciate, first of all, Jennifer, for sharing not only your thoughtfulness and helping us to unpack and consider things from multiple points of view, but also for really this being in the spirit of manifesting inclusion and helping us think about to manifest, like to make something, to make it into reality. Like how can we make our spaces more neuro-inclusive and neuro-supportive, appreciating, and sometimes defiant. So thank you so much. And I just want to echo the comments from the audience who joined us, that they also expressed their appreciation for, hearing about your life and your ways of building community and being authentic and loving and appreciative to yourself. And so our thanks to everyone. Please do stay connected with us. Our next part of our speaker series will be next Thursday at 1 o'clock. And so we really hope that you'll come back and join us again. Thanks all.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We appreciate y'all for coming. Bye now.